The year was 1944. Winter had gripped Europe in its iron fist, and the wind whispered over frozen fields like a mournful ghost. In a remote Allied prisoner-of-war camp in France, a group of German female soldiers huddled together, their uniforms thin and tattered, their eyes hollow from weeks of hunger and fear. The world outside seemed impossibly distant. Smoke from bombed towns drifting like memories across the landscape, the distant rumble of artillery reminding them of the chaos they had once been part of. Yet inside the camp, a strange, almost surreal quiet settled, broken only by the shuffle of boots on the frost-hardened earth and the murmured conversations of women clinging to fragments of hope. For these women, the notion of mercy had long been an abstract concept. Something they had read about or heard whispered in stories, but never truly experienced. They had fought, they had fled, they had surrendered, and now they waited, uncertain of what the next day might bring. Then as the dawn broke, a wooden cart creaked into the yard, laden with steaming bowls of food. The aroma was intoxicating, warm bread, rich soups, and thin slices of meat, all offered without suspicion or demand. It was an act of kindness that seemed impossible in a world defined by brutality. For a fleeting moment, hunger collided with gratitude, fear softened into awe, and these women realized that even in the midst of war, humanity could still shine. Their hands trembled as they reached for the food, unsure if this was a gift or a test. In that moment, they discovered a truth far more powerful than any weapon. Mercy, served simply on a plate, could pierce the hardest hearts and ignite a fragile flame of hope in even the darkest of times. The first morning the food arrived, the camp seemed different. Dawn broke slowly over the frostbitten fields, painting the sky in shades of icy blue and pale gold, yet inside the barracks the atmosphere was thick with tension and disbelief. The German women, prisoners of war who had endured weeks of hunger and relentless cold, sat clustered together on wooden benches, their eyes hollow, their clothes ragged, their bodies stiff with exhaustion. Their hands, thin and brittle from insufficient nourishment, fidgeted in their laps. For them, the concept of mercy had been abstract for so long that when it arrived in the form of steaming bowls of food, it almost seemed unreal. A wooden cart creaked along the frozen path, wheels grinding against the compacted dirt, announcing the arrival of the morning rations. The women turned toward the noise, some with suspicion, some with hope that they barely allowed themselves to acknowledge. There was a moment of silence, a suspended pause, as they stared at the officers who had stepped from the shadows of the barracks entrance, carrying ladles and bowls. The women's eyes were wide, mouths dry and barely moving, and a palpable tension gripped the room. Was this a trick, a test, or impossibly an act of genuine kindness? The officers' faces were calm but serious, with a subtle softness in their expressions that unsettled the prisoners even more. They did not speak harsh words. They did not demand obedience. They simply began to serve the food. The first ladle of soup was offered to a young woman, barely more than a girl, whose hands shook violently as they hovered over the steaming bowl. The aroma, rich, earthy, warm, hit her senses like a wave, and she gasped involuntarily. She looked at the officer with a mixture of fear and astonishment, and he nodded gently, an almost imperceptible smile on his lips. The girl took a tentative sip, then another, her body relaxing slightly as the warmth spread through her chest, easing the gnawing emptiness that had been her constant companion for weeks. Around her, other women hesitated in the same way, some lowering their heads in embarrassment, others staring wide-eyed at the bowls, as if trying to convince themselves that this was not a mirage. Slowly, hands reached out, shaking but determined, and the officers filled the bowls with steaming broth, slices of bread, and a few thin cuts of meat. Every spoonful was a revelation. The taste was simple yet exquisite, rich and sustaining, carrying with it more than nutrients. It carried dignity, recognition, and a message they could barely articulate. You are human. You are seen. You are not forgotten. As the women ate, the room seemed to transform. The oppressive silence that had hung over the barracks began to lift. Small, almost inaudible sighs of relief punctuated the quiet. Eyes met across tables, and for the first time in weeks there was acknowledgement, not of the enemy, not of the war, but of shared survival. Some women reached instinctively to touch a sister's hand, a gesture of solidarity born of mutual suffering. Others sat silently, tears glistening in their eyes, savoring the taste of warmth that went far beyond the food itself. The act of eating had become an act of remembrance, a reclaiming of their humanity in a place where it had seemed irretrievably lost. The officers moved among them quietly, their presence steady and non-threatening. They did not rush the women, did not scold them for their trembling hands or hesitant movements. They simply offered the sustenance, observing the subtle shift that began to take place, the easing of tension, the softening of hardened faces, the fragile reawakening of trust. The prisoners were learning, slowly, that mercy could be delivered in silence, in the careful preparation of a meal, in the willingness to recognize another's suffering and respond without demand or expectation. Outside, the cold wind continued to bite at the edges of the camp, carrying with it the distant sounds of artillery and the faint echoes of a world still at war. Yet within the barracks, warmth spread not only from the food, but from the realization that even amidst destruction, human compassion could exist. One prisoner, older than the rest and with a face carved by hardship, let out a quiet, almost inaudible laugh, a sound so rare that it startled those nearby. Another clasped a hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the emotion that the first spoonful of soup had unlocked. Relief. Gratitude, disbelief, and most importantly, hope. The women began to whisper to one another, sharing fragments of their thoughts, quietly commenting on the flavors, the warmth, the kindness of the act itself. It was as if every bite reminded them of a world beyond the barbed wire, beyond the hunger, beyond the war, a world where human beings could still act with empathy and care. The simple act of receiving food, something so basic and ordinary in times of peace, had become a transformative experience, reshaping their perception of the enemy and of what it meant to be treated with dignity in the face of unimaginable adversity. As the meal concluded, a calm settled over the barracks. Plates were emptied, bowls scraped clean, yet the sense of fullness extended beyond their stomachs. It lingered in their hearts and minds, a realization that survival was intertwined with the capacity for empathy, and that even in captivity, mercy could find a way to touch lives. Their hands, once shaky and tentative, now moved with deliberate care as they returned the bowls, an unspoken understanding passing between prisoners and officers alike. This was more than sustenance. It was a lifeline, a bridge across enemy lines. A quiet but undeniable declaration that compassion could exist even in the darkest hours. In that moment, the women understood a simple but profound truth, that mercy could pierce fear, that kindness could ignite hope, and that food, something so ordinary, could become a vessel for human connection, transcending language, nationality, and the rigid divisions of war. For the first time in weeks, they felt seen, recognized, and, perhaps most shockingly, safe. In the smallest gestures, in the steaming bowls offered without question or demand, they found a glimmer of humanity, a fleeting but transformative mercy that would remain with them long after the camp's gates were finally opened. As the days passed, the routine of meals became more than just a matter of survival. It became a fragile ritual of solace and subtle transformation. The barracks, once silent and heavy with despair, began to hum softly with cautious conversation and whispered laughter. Each morning, the German female prisoners would gather, their movements still hesitant but marked by a flicker of anticipation that had been absent for weeks. They were no longer just waiting for the next ration. They were waiting for connection, for the small human warmth that each meal seemed to carry. What had once been the stark, hollow act of eating became a moment where their shared suffering intersected with the quiet generosity of their captors. Food, simple and unadorned, became a symbol of something far greater than nutrition. Each loaf of bread, each ladle of broth, each thin slice of meat was a message, a bridge across the divisions of war. The women began to notice details they had long ignored, the way the bread was arranged neatly on wooden tables, the careful presentation of the meals, the subtle warmth retained in the bowls despite the chill of the barracks. These were not careless gestures. They were deliberate acts of care, a wordless assertion that even the lowest-ranked soldiers, even the defeated and captured, deserved dignity. In these small, deliberate acts, the prisoners began to feel the first hints of trust. Over time, the environment in the barracks began to shift imperceptibly. The initial silence, punctuated only by the sound of scraping wooden benches and the occasional clink of a spoon against a bowl, slowly gave way to murmurs of conversation. At first, the whispers were tentative, as if the women were afraid to break the fragile bubble of safety that had settled over them. But soon, these whispered exchanges became opportunities to share memories, to speak of their families, to describe the small comforts of home they had left behind. Laughter, soft and careful at first, began to punctuate the meals like faint birdsong in a winter forest. It was a sound so unexpected that some of the older prisoners blinked in disbelief, uncertain if their ears were deceiving them. And yet each giggle, each shared glance, was proof that the merciful act of feeding them had restored something nearly lost, their humanity. The women began to see patterns, rituals even, emerging around the meals. A small group would gather before the arrival of the officers, preparing the tables in silent cooperation, arranging the bowls, passing out bread with a care that mirrored the generosity they had received. They learned over the days to anticipate the arrival of the cart and to organize themselves, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to preserve the dignity of the moment. There was pride in these actions, a quiet reclamation of agency in a space where power had so long been taken from them. Each act of careful preparation, each shared glance of understanding, was a statement. Even prisoners, even women who had surrendered in war, could create order and beauty in a world that seemed defined by chaos. With the rhythm of these meals, subtle bonds formed, not only between the prisoners themselves, but also between prisoners and the officers who served them. The women began to recognize the quiet humanity in the faces that had once represented authority and control. There was a consistency to the care, a steadiness to the distribution that could not be ignored. Slowly, trust began to take root. The officers were no longer just men in uniform. They were providers of life, witnesses to suffering, participants in a delicate dance of mercy. The food, in its simplicity, became the conduit through which empathy flowed. Every ladle of soup and every loaf of bread carried with it the unspoken promise that even amidst war, human kindness could persist. The act of eating became meditative. Each bite was not only nourishment, but a ceremony of recognition. The women began to savor not in greed, but in reverence for the rare kindness extended to them. Bread was torn carefully, soup sipped slowly, and meat shared with quiet generosity. There was a rhythm to the meals, an ebb and flow of trust and gratitude, fear and relief. Some prisoners would glance across the table at others and exchange a small smile. The gesture, small yet monumental in the barren reality of war. These moments, fleeting though they were, created a tapestry of human connection, fragile and tentative, but deeply enduring. Even the environment of the barracks, once oppressive and cold, seemed transformed. Sunlight filtering through frost-covered windows illuminated the steam rising from the bowls, casting a golden haze over the wooden tables. Shadows of the prisoners stretched long against the walls, giving a sense of life and movement to a space that had once felt frozen in time. The simple act of sharing a meal imbued the surroundings with a subtle warmth that no fire could replicate. Walls that had echoed only with despair now carried faint notes of hope and cautious conversation. The barracks, previously a symbol of confinement, was slowly becoming a sanctuary, a place where mercy and humanity could quietly flourish. Even amidst the lingering threat of war, beyond the gates, the women began to look forward to these meals in ways that transcended hunger. Each serving of bread or broth was not just sustenance. It was an affirmation of existence, a reminder that they were more than prisoners, more than enemy soldiers captured and dehumanized. The small acts of mercy, the careful ladling of soup, the even placement of bread, the warmth of a kind glance, reinforced the notion that they were still seen, still acknowledged, still capable of receiving care. In this recognition, they found themselves reclaiming fragments of their dignity, pieces of their identity that had been stripped away by weeks of fear, hunger, and isolation. And with each meal, the women grew stronger, not only in body but in spirit. Laughter became more confident, conversation more natural, gestures more fluid. There was a subtle blossoming of camaraderie, a network of support woven around the shared experience of nourishment and the quiet mercy extended to them. In these moments, the camp was not just a prison, but a place where the humanity of the captors and captives intersected in fragile, transformative ways. They were learning slowly and cautiously that even amidst the rigid structures of war, empathy and care could be expressed, received, and cherished in the quiet after the meals. As bowls were scraped clean and empty plates stacked, the women often lingered. Some would glance toward the windows, tracing the frost patterns, lost in reflection. Others would exchange knowing looks, silently acknowledging the extraordinary nature of what they had received. The realization was profound. Survival was not only about enduring hunger, cold, and fear. It was about recognizing and cherishing moments of humanity when they appeared, and allowing those moments to nourish not just the body, but the soul. Through these acts of mercy, a simple meal became a sacred ritual, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the quiet power of compassion. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it complete, but it was undeniable. The women began to carry themselves differently, their movements less tense, their eyes more alert to subtle signs of kindness. Each meal reinforced a simple yet powerful truth, that even in captivity, even in the midst of war, mercy could be offered, received, and remembered. The women learned to anticipate these small rituals, to value the care hidden in the most ordinary acts, and to understand that sometimes survival was as much about the heart as it was about the body. The barracks, once silent and foreboding, became a living space of tentative hope, proof that kindness could persist even where it seemed impossible. As the days stretched into weeks, the German female prisoners began to notice subtleties in the meals they were served. Small, almost imperceptible details that spoke volumes about the care behind them. The soup was always warm, the bread always fresh, and the occasional treat, sometimes a few squares of chocolate or a sprinkle of sugar on a simple dessert, was placed with deliberate thoughtfulness. These gestures were not mandated by any rule or regulation. They were acts of attention, proof that someone, somewhere, had chosen to consider their well-being. For women who had been reduced to mere numbers on a roster, these small touches carried immense significance. It was as if the officers were saying without words, "We see you, you matter, even here, even now." Each meal became a lesson in empathy, a quiet unveiling of a truth that had seemed impossible in the midst of war, that humanity could exist even between enemies. The prisoners began to recognize the effort put into the preparation. The way the broth was simmered to maintain warmth, how the bread was sliced evenly, how small portions of flavor were included in what otherwise might have been a meager ration. There was a rhythm to it, a care embedded in each ladle, each placement of a dish. With every bite, the women's understanding of mercy deepened. They realized that it was not merely the food itself that nourished, but the thought and intention behind it. The recognition of their suffering and the choice to respond with kindness, the act of eating began to nurture more than just their bodies. It fed their memories, their spirits, and their sense of self-worth. Each small detail, The careful cutting of bread, the addition of a hint of spice, the steaming bowl held out with a steady hand, was an affirmation of dignity. Women who had spent weeks in near silence began to share stories of home, of their families, of the life they had left behind. Conversations blossomed over the tables, tentative at first, then gradually more confident, as the rhythm of meals provided a safe space for connection. Laughter, once rare and almost forbidden in the barracks, returned like a hesitant bird testing the air. It was soft, careful but genuine, a sound that transformed the space from a place of mere survival into one where hope could quietly thrive. Trust, fragile and slow to form, began to emerge as a byproduct of this daily ritual. The prisoners began to anticipate the presence of the officers during meals, not with fear, but with a tentative sense of reassurance. They observed subtle cues, the way the officers moved among them, the gentle patience in their gestures, the lack of hurried authority in their distribution of food. This quiet consistency became a foundation for a nascent sense of safety. The women started to understand that mercy could be deliberate, methodical and patient, and that it could create bonds where none had been thought possible. These meals became more than sustenance. They were bridges, spanning the chasm of enmity, forging connections through the simplest of human acts. The prisoners began to internalize the lessons embedded in these meals. They saw that mercy was not weakness, but strength expressed in subtle, transformative ways. The small attentions, the chocolate tucked into a tray, the bread arranged neatly on plates, the careful ladling of soup, were instruments of hope. They reminded the women that even in the harshest of circumstances, care and compassion could flourish. Every meal became a study in the power of empathy, the ability to act with consideration, to nourish not only the body but the spirit, to acknowledge the humanity of those who were otherwise defined by their status as captives. Observing the officers closely, some of the women began to reflect on the complexity of human behavior in wartime. Here were men who had once been their enemies, now performing quiet acts of generosity without expectation or reward. It challenged their assumptions, reshaping their understanding of loyalty, duty, and morality in the theater of war. The recognition of this complexity, the intertwining of authority and empathy, of duty and mercy, fostered a subtle evolution within the prisoners themselves. They began to see themselves not only as survivors, but as participants in a fragile, moral exchange that transcended the rigid categories imposed by conflict. The impact of these meals extended beyond the immediate nourishment of body and spirit. It created patterns of reflection and conversation that lasted long after the bowls were emptied. Women discussed the small acts of mercy with one another, recounting the kindnesses and sharing their interpretations. They compared notes on how the bread was sliced, the care in serving the soup, the gentle smiles that accompanied each distribution. These exchanges reinforced the idea that humanity could exist in unlikely places, that empathy could transcend the boundaries of allegiance and nationality. And that recognition of another's suffering was a form of power as profound as any weapon. Even the physical surroundings of the barracks seemed to transform in the wake of these meals. The once cold and oppressive space was softened by the warmth emanating from the food, the gestures of care, and the slowly returning laughter of the prisoners. Sunlight filtered through frost-laden windows, catching the rising steam from the bowls and casting golden ethereal patterns across wooden floors and tables. Shadows of the women, elongated and dancing with movement, seemed to breathe life into the barracks. Where there had been silence and emptiness, there was now a subtle hum of vitality, the quiet evidence that mercy, even in its simplest forms, could transform an environment and the people within it. The women also began to internalize a new sense of agency. The rituals surrounding the meals, preparing the tables, arranging bread, ensuring every bowl was filled, allowed them to participate actively in the continuity of mercy. They were no longer passive recipients. They became stewards of dignity, responsible for honoring the care they had received. This participation reinforced their self-worth and cultivated a sense of purpose even in captivity. Each action, however small, became a thread in a broader tapestry of compassion and survival, a testament to the enduring power of human connection in the most unlikely circumstances. The realization that food could embody mercy and care led to profound reflections among the prisoners. They began to perceive that nourishment was not merely a physical necessity, but a vehicle for the restoration of identity, for the reaffirmation of humanity, and for the quiet resistance to the dehumanizing forces of war. Every meal offered a tangible lesson, that empathy could exist in the midst of hostility, that acts of kindness could shape perception and foster resilience, and that even in captivity, one could reclaim fragments of dignity and hope. The power of these acts, so deceptively simple, was transformative, leaving impressions that would last long after the barracks were left behind, and as each day ended, and the women returned to their bunks, the echoes of shared meals lingered in the quiet spaces of their minds. The warmth, both literal and symbolic, stayed with them, a reminder that survival extended beyond physical endurance. It was also about recognizing the mercy offered to them, internalizing it, and allowing it to nurture the human spirit. In these moments of reflection, they came to understand a subtle truth, that compassion, even in the smallest gestures, could transcend boundaries, challenge assumptions, and leave an indelible mark on those who received it. Through the simple yet profound act of being fed with care, the prisoners discovered not only the taste of sustenance, but the enduring sweetness of mercy itself. By the time the prisoners' release drew near, the simple daily ritual of shared meals had left an indelible mark upon their hearts and minds. What had begun as cautious suspicion, the hesitant acceptance of bread, soup, and the occasional treat, had blossomed into a profound understanding of the paradoxical humanity that existed even amid the horrors of war. They had come to see that survival was not only a matter of enduring physical deprivation, but also of recognizing, embracing, and cherishing moments of compassion when they appeared. Every meal had been a lesson, a quiet, transformative education in the mercies that could persist even in the darkest circumstances. As the women prepared to step beyond the gates of the camp, the memories of these meals lingered vividly. They recalled the warmth of the broth on their tongues, the careful arrangement of bread and simple slices of meat, and the occasional unexpected sweetness of chocolate, a luxury in a world otherwise defined by scarcity. These memories were intertwined with emotions that went far beyond hunger or physical sustenance. Relief, gratitude, and awe had mingled with lingering fear and the raw exhaustion of captivity, creating a complex emotional landscape that each woman carried within her. They had learned in the most subtle ways that mercy could exist even across enemy lines, and that acts of kindness, small, deliberate, human, could resonate far longer than any fear or animosity. The camp itself became a symbol of this paradoxical humanity. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, and the frost-laden ground that had once seemed so unyielding were now backdrops to an extraordinary story of empathy. The officers who had delivered the meals were no longer faceless enforcers of authority. They had become witnesses to suffering, participants in a delicate moral exchange, and agents of quiet mercy. The women recalled the patient way in which bowls were ladled, the calm expressions that met their uncertain eyes, and the unspoken messages of recognition embedded in each gesture. In these acts, the prisoners discovered that the boundaries between enemy and ally could blur, and that compassion had the power to transcend the rigid categorizations imposed by war. Walking through the camp gates, the prisoners carried with them not only the physical endurance that had allowed them to survive, but also the emotional resilience nurtured through these shared moments of mercy. They remembered the way sunlight had streamed through frost-covered windows, illuminating steam rising from bowls of soup and casting ethereal golden light across their faces. They recalled the gentle clinking of spoons against wooden bowls, the low hum of whispered conversations, the small smiles exchanged across tables that had once been filled only with anxiety and hunger. These details, seemingly mundane at the time, had accumulated into a rich mosaic of memory, a testament to the power of compassion to transform even the bleakest circumstances, even beyond the gates. The women carried the lessons of the meals with them. They had learned that mercy could be offered without expectation, that empathy could cross boundaries of nationality and allegiance, and that acts of kindness, no matter how small, could leave lasting impressions on those who received them. The memory of being fed with care, of being recognized and seen as human, despite their status as prisoners, would follow them for years, shaping how they perceived others, how they responded to suffering, and how they understood the complexity of human morality. The lessons of the barracks, distilled into the simple, powerful act of feeding, became a guide for navigating a world that, even in peace, would remain fraught with conflict and misunderstanding. In reflection, the prisoners realized that food had been more than sustenance. It had been a vehicle for mercy, a tangible manifestation of compassion that reached across barriers of fear, hunger, and enmity. Every shared loaf, every steaming bowl, every deliberate touch in the act of serving had carried the unspoken truth that human beings could choose kindness even when history and circumstance suggested otherwise. In this understanding, the women discovered that survival was not only about enduring hardship, but also about embracing the fleeting, transformative moments when the world revealed its capacity for empathy. These acts, seemingly simple, had the power to heal, to connect, and to leave an enduring imprint on the soul. The emotional resonance of these meals was mirrored in the physical environment. The barracks, once cold and oppressive, had been softened by the presence of warmth, both literal and figurative. Sunlight filtering through the frost-painted windows, the soft glow of lanterns during evening meals, and the careful placement of bread and utensils on wooden tables created spaces of subtle beauty amidst desolation. The prisoners learned to associate these surroundings with comfort and dignity, reinforcing the sense that mercy could exist even in the harshest circumstances. They saw that human beings could impose order, care, and consideration upon an environment defined by scarcity and fear, transforming it into a place where resilience and hope could flourish. Perhaps most profoundly, the women understood that the impact of these meals extended far beyond the moment itself. The memory of being nourished with care would shape their understanding of empathy, compassion, and moral responsibility for the rest of their lives. They had learned that acts of kindness, no matter how small or routine, could leave lasting impressions, bridging gaps between enemies and restoring humanity where it had been threatened. This knowledge, carried quietly within them, became a foundation for rebuilding not only their own lives, but also for approaching the world with a nuanced understanding of human complexity, capable of recognizing mercy even where it seemed impossible. As they stepped into the wider world, leaving the camp behind, the taste of those meals lingered on their tongues, mingling with the deeper flavors of memory and gratitude. They remembered the tactile sensation of bread breaking in their hands, the warmth of soup spreading through their bodies, and the subtle sweetness of chocolate that had seemed almost miraculous in its rarity. Each sensory memory was accompanied by a complex emotional imprint, the astonishment at receiving care from former enemies, the relief of being nourished, and the quiet, persistent recognition that mercy could coexist with conflict. These impressions had become part of their identity, shaping how they would perceive the world and interact with others long after the war ended. Even in the months and years that followed, the women carried the legacy of these acts with them. They recalled the gentle attentiveness of the officers, the quiet dignity of the shared meals, and the sense of recognition that had restored a fragment of their humanity. These memories served as a reminder that mercy was not an abstract ideal, but a tangible force capable of transforming lives. The lessons of the barracks, the power of food to convey empathy, the ability of small gestures to bridge divides, the enduring imprint of compassion, remained etched in their consciousness. They had learned, profoundly and irrevocably, that in the midst of suffering, humanity could assert itself quietly, insistently, and irrevocably. And in the end, the women carried with them a paradoxical understanding that the harshest circumstances could coexist with profound acts of mercy, that enemies could become unexpected agents of humanity, and that even the simplest gestures, like a warm meal offered without question, could leave impressions as deep as any weapon could wound. Food had been more than nourishment. It had been a vessel for moral revelation, a medium through which mercy was communicated and internalized, and a lifeline connecting bodies, minds, and hearts. The barracks, the officers, and the meals had become a testament to the enduring power of compassion, a story to be remembered long after the war had faded into history.